Mr. Kaplan, you spoke about issues and accountability at the UN and mentioned that we should tighten mandatory disclosure requirements and add clear consequences for failure to comply. Can you provide some more details on what you think that should look like, and would you recommend additional auditing and transparency tools?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. It's just a constant source of frustration. It should frustrate every single American taxpayer where money is going to the United Nations, where money continues to go to UN agencies. Again, they're a one bucket of recipient. You have UN agencies, NGOs, and contractors. When it comes to the UN, we have the least enforcement remedies available. We have the least access and the least transparency in that. So I think there's absolutely means to tighten up. In the 2024 Appropriations Act, there's a specific clause, Section 7048, if you're keeping score at home, that requires the Secretary of State to seek to implement in all agreements with the UN access for the USAID IG, State IG, and GAO. That is essential, and failure to comply with that should either result in not receiving an award or reward remedies for noncompliance.
All right, well, I appreciate that, and I agree. I want to go with this logic for a second that because there was waste, fraud, and abuse in USAID, we should get rid of it, right? Which that was the argument. I assume you would agree that in a $7 trillion budget, we could probably find, in fact, we have found waste, fraud, and abuse in every department, right?
That's why you have inspectors general to root it out.
That's right. So there's waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, right?
Correct.
And there's waste, fraud, and abuse in DHS.
Yes.
In fact, we just saw the other day $200 million, right, to be spent on advertising, right? That sounds like a waste to me. I mean, it was more money that was spent on the last Jurassic Park movie or one of the Lord of the Rings movies or one of the Harry Potter movies. I think the Barbie movie was less expensive. In fact, I think every movie except one that was nominated for an Oscar was less expensive than what Kristi Noem spent. To spend $200 million, Kristi Noem, and not get nominated by an Oscar, I think shows their liberal bias. So there's definitely waste, right? But no one's talking about getting rid of those places. No one's talking about, just because we're spending, $9 million on crab legs in the Pentagon, or $220 million on furniture in the Pentagon, or, $100,000 on a Steinway piano in the Pentagon. No one's talking about getting rid of the Pentagon just because there's waste, fraud, and abuse, right? That would be unreasonable, Mr. Kaplan. You agree?
No one's talking about getting rid of those agencies.
Right, of course, right? So and that's where the disconnect is here, is that somehow because this agency, no different than all the other agencies, we could sit, HUD, Department of Agriculture, we could go through them, right? There's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we owe it to the American people, by the way, to eliminate that waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no excuse for that, okay? We owe it to them. But in the search of trying to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't mean we should get rid of an entire agency. No, we should eliminate the waste, fraud, and abuse from those agencies, because all of these agencies still have important functions. Obviously, the Pentagon, we're not getting rid of the Pentagon, even though they haven't been able to pass an audit 8 years in a row. There's over $2.5 trillion, let me say that again, over $2.5 trillion missing in the Pentagon, like real money, okay? And no one's talking about getting rid of it. And so, that's the function of the problem I have. Look, in my own household budget, right, I can tell you my kids are definitely, there's tons of waste in my family budget based on what my kids like to spend, okay? There's definitely abuse going on. And based on the amount of boxes that show up in my house every day, my wife is definitely committing fraud, okay? But the point is, I'm not getting rid of these people, right? What am I going to do? I'm going to sit them down at the kitchen table, and I'm going to say, we need to spend less, right? What are we spending on? We didn't have that conversation here with USAID. We never got to say, hey, look, these programs, delete them. These things, get rid of them, okay? Every other agency somehow is getting that benefit of the doubt, right? We're giving that benefit of the doubt to the Pentagon. I want to end with this. Now that these functions are going to move over to the State Department, all right, Mr. Kaplan, do you think the State Department has the resources, the personnel to do all of this oversight, the grant oversight, to the capacity to handle all of this without adding more personnel to the State Department?
Let me begin with this, Congressman Moskowitz. I can assure you that the same vile predators that sought to steal from USAID or divert funds to terrorist organizations or sexually abuse minors like they did in the Ebola response will try to do the same thing at state.
Yeah, and look, that's all terrible. We all support, clamping down on that and getting rid of it. My question is, do you think the State Department at this juncture needs additional resources now that they have all this additional responsibility?
Contrary to media reports, foreign assistance programs are not dead, and there are billions and billions and billions of dollars now being spent and administered by not only State Department,
my
but
time is up. I'm just trying to get an answer. So, okay, yes, I'm with you. But do you now think that now that that is all moved over to the State Department, do they need more resources to limit the fraud, waste, and abuse? Because otherwise, aren't we going to wind up in the same situation where there's going to be fraud, waste, and abuse because we're not investing in that oversight?
Maximum oversight is essential, and that's what we brought as the IG for USAID. And when you have billions going out in complex emergency environments and money spent overseas in areas controlled by terrorist organizations and any armed group, you need adequate staffing, people, good monitoring, and an effective IG to oversee and investigate any misuse of those funds.
What makes this exchange stand out is not just the headline-grabbing number, but the deeper argument being built underneath it, an argument about how we think about government accountability, and more importantly, how inconsistently we apply it. When Moskowitz raises the idea of trillions of dollars being missing from the Pentagon, it immediately triggers a strong reaction. But what he's really pointing to is something more structural. The Pentagon has failed multiple audits over the years, which doesn't necessarily mean that literal piles of cash have disappeared, but that the Department of Defense cannot fully track, verify, or account for how vast portions of its budget are spent. In practical terms, that signals a breakdown in financial transparency. And in any system, public or private, when you cannot trace where money is going, you lose the ability to evaluate efficiency, prevent misuse, or enforce accountability.